The Georgia man accused of plotting a jihad attack on the White House is expected to appear in federal courtrooms this Thursday. He's been identified as 21-year-old Hijacker Jalal Tahib. The criminal complaint indicates that Tahib is charged as the result of a year-long investigation by FBI Atlanta's Joint Terrorism Task Force, and that the Joint Terrorism Task Force partners led by the FBI arrested Hijacker Tahib, 21 years old, of Cummings, Georgia, after a thorough investigation into his plans to attack federal buildings. But what the report doesn't show is that FBI informants took very active roles. Some critics describe this as legal entrapment. So joining us to discuss all of this in New York, Andrew Dalack. He's an attorney there. Andrew, thanks for being with us today. So this story, I guess to a lay person, this sounds like the FBI set Tahib up. Is this a story of entrapment that we're hearing?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, Manila. I think to a lay person, it might seem like entrapment. I think the short answer is it could be. Entrapment from a legal standpoint, the legal defense of entrapment is available when, one, the government has induced a person into participating in a particular crime or to actually acting out a particular criminal offense. But then second, when that person is also not predisposed to perpetrating that offense. And it's that predisposition prong of the entrapment defense that makes it so elusive for many criminal defendants, because it's quite easy for the government to show, especially in these terrorism cases, that an individual is predisposed to, in this case, say, attacking the White House or attacking the Statue of Liberty, based on their comments, interactions, ideas before they came into contact with law enforcement.
Now, like you said, predisposed, that's kind of this gray area. So where's the fine line between, you know, a young, vulnerable, angry man just venting online to a guy that we then call a would-be terrorist? Because it would appear that maybe his religion played a role.
Sure. I mean, that's a really good question. I think that cases like Mr. Tahib sort of present the lowest hanging fruit of terrorism investigations and prosecutions. Look, I'm a criminal defense attorney, but I am sympathetic to the government's position. When it comes to terrorism, especially post 9/11, people expect the government to prevent crimes of terrorism before they take place. If we think about it in the typical drug or narcotics offenses, these undercover operations occur in general when the FBI or the police have identified an individual who's engaged in drug activity, and then they send a confidential informant or a government agent in to buy more drugs off that person, and then that action becomes the basis for criminal liability. In the terrorism context, what we see here is that young, impressionable, sometimes people of dubious intellectual abilities, not to say that that's the case with Mr. Tahib, but we've seen that in prior cases, they'll go online, they'll vent, they'll say all sorts of stuff that is sympathetic to ISIS ideology, Al-Qaeda, other Islamic extremism or radical thoughts and organizations, and then that will be the basis for a government agent or an FBI law enforcement agency or whatever to go reach out to that person, make contact, and then over the course of a year, 2 years, hatch a plan with that person, and then the moment before that person believes they're going to actually participate in an action, arrest them. So there is that fine line, and I think that the problem is people like Mr. Tahib, who at first glance it seems he suffers from mental health issues, he might be delusional. There has to be an alternative to criminal investigation and prosecution. We should be looking to help those individuals so that they actually don't become terrorists, instead of having law enforcement direct resources and manpower to turning them into terrorists.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up, because do people in Tahib's shoes stand a chance of getting out of this legal battle and maybe getting some mental health assistance, or is this guy just kind of done in by the system?
That's also a really difficult question. So much of it will depend on what his defense attorneys are able to work out with the prosecutors. When somebody is, in this case, I don't know if Mr. Tahib has actually been indicted yet or if he's being presented based on the criminal information, but once the grand jury has indicted for somebody on a particular offense, it's very difficult to sort of undo that indictment. Of course, the prosecution can decide to recharge that person. The defense can challenge the sufficiency of the indictment. They could even, make a pretrial challenge to the indictment based on an entrapment defense or outrageous government conduct. But what it's going to come down to is whether or not the government actually sees a purpose or an incentive to do something differently with Mr. Tahib. That could come in the form of asking him to cooperate in future investigations. It could be that they see him as somebody who's particularly mentally ill or disturbed, and that would be the basis for some sort of a deferred prosecution agreement. It's really hard to say. But unfortunately, experience tells us that he's probably going to be stuck in the system and will go to prison for a very long time for this.
Yeah, I could probably agree with that with my experience as well. So tell me this, last thing, how do stories like this play out among at-risk communities or marginalized groups like it seems like Mr. Tlaib was?
Well, think about it this way. What is the incentive for people, and let's just say we'll talk about the Muslim community now and the Muslim community from which Mr. Tlaib hails. What's their incentive to identify individuals who are sort of on the fringe or on the brink of flirting with radical Islamic ideology or ISIS or other, extremist organizations? If the community identifies these people and says, okay, these people need help, to whom do they turn? If they go to the FBI and they sort of, give the FBI a tip, they have no control over what the FBI does with that information, and that could actually lead the FBI to conduct an investigation that will lead to them being arrested for some sort of a terrorism-related plot. So there really are no outlets for the community, and what it does, these kinds of low-hanging fruit terrorism prosecutions and investigations, is it exacerbates pre-existing tensions between the Muslim community and law enforcement and makes it very difficult for the FBI to do what it originally set out to do, which is prevent new crimes of terrorism. If the FBI is really interested in doing that, it should be looking to invest resources in how to make meaningful long-term relationships with Muslim communities and not undermining those relationships by going after their most vulnerable.
Yeah, certainly puts them between a rock and a hard place. Andrew Dalack, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.